we have always used this analogy of a local bar. Like, what would a platform be like if it was a local bar? Local bars are successful if people show up, if people have fun, if people spend money, enough money to keep the lights on. We have our like kind of atrophied our like muscle of collaboration over decades and decades.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode of NEWFORUM. And we're always happy to bring you awesome creators, founders, visionaries, and investors from the Web3 space. And on today's episode, I'm honored to have with me Robey, who's one of the founding members of Metalabel, and he's going to be sharing his passion for the collective internet culture, shared ownership, and new models for online creative economy. Hi Austin, how's it going?
Hi, good to be here.
Yeah, so I saw your background is very diverse. You worked in the arts, you also been like designing, but I want to know like what made you pursue especially Metalabel and what made you venture into the Web3 space?
Yeah, I do have a background as a designer, which I think colors a lot of the work that I've done. I initially studied architecture and ran a design studio after that. Yeah, I think like an interesting kind of result of that is viewing a lot of things as kind of design challenges of creatively structuring the world around us through constraints. And I think that like kind of thinking applies to many other things. And I've also played music and been a part of many creative communities as well. And that led to starting a platform with some great people called Ampled, which is a cooperative platform that's like a Patreon alternative that's owned by artists. And I think that kind of ties into this approaching a kind of entrepreneurship, but through like an organizational design lens. Like, how can you create organizations that structurally are more fair or more accountable or more equitable? And that led to becoming a co-op that's collectively owned by users. That thread of exploration has led me to be interested in Web3 and the possibilities there when it comes to thinking about collective ownership and collective governance. And I think that I'm excited about the exploration of these tools towards those ends of creating more democratic, more equitable organizations, and specifically ones where creative people join together to form their own self-sufficient community networks and economies. And that is what I think ties in with Metalabel. Metalabel supports groups of creative people that come together with a common purpose to release work together. So I see this as like a really interesting, rich area of exploration of where do we go from the kind of more traditional online creator economy that is individualized creators to compete against one another for time, space, attention, audience, and find ways for some like a forms of creator mutualism or creator solidarity, ways for creators to come together and release work as groups or through a common identity. So I think like there is a common thread through all that kind of professional narrative arc, and that's just I see it as very interesting of finding where our creative economy can be more collective and mutual and plural and have people support one another and release work collaboratively and in new ways.
Yeah, and I remember the last time we talked with Yancey about Metalabel, I remember mentioning DAOs, and he was like, he's not exactly like bullish on DAOs, but he's bullish on internet communities. And I want to know from your perspective, like what do you see has been working and not working for these communities, and like what kind of elements have to be there to enhance like the collective's value proposition and everything?
Yeah, so Yancey Strickler is a co-founder of Metalable, and I don't know if I look at I think the Web3 space more specifically, I think maybe even since that podcast recorded, maybe we have a different cultural understanding of what a DAO even means, or maybe it even means less than it did then. I'm not sure how people would define it now. And I think that's like really one of the reasons for introducing this term of a meta label is I think that the term DAO maybe carries less of a meaning, is less specific. And I think there's a deficiency in the language that we use for creative collaboration. I think the term collective is too broad. And I would think of a meta label as a kind of group that has existed like since the 1600s of people coming together to release creative work together. And I would define a meta label as a group that has a kind of cultural aim at the heart of what they're doing, whether that's an idea, a perspective, an aesthetic. Like the core of promoting that is like the reason for existing, and doing that through releases of work. And I think there is a lot of that that's kind of natively built into Web3, whether that's like seasons, thinking about specific drops or specific campaigns. So we see a release not in a music context, but as like any form of media. When I think about the term DAO, I just don't know how helpful it is anymore. And I think that like introducing language that helps us be more specific not only helps groups understand and define who they are. A lot of groups came to us and like, oh, we're a meta label. But I think like framing an idea for a way that groups can come together and collaborate helps that idea spread. And I think it helps other people join together and say, let's join together and release work in this way.
Yeah, and you also published a book called After the Creative Economy. And we're kind of like in this, I would say, state where everyone has sort of an internet personality and they all kind of like everyone is on the internet, right? And we all share assets and values and texts and everything. And I'm wondering, what do you think is the next stage of this after the creative economy? Like, what is the next stage of this aspiration economy?
Yeah, we published this zine, which ended up being long enough to kind of be a book called After the Creator Economy. And it is a focus on a lot of the kind of personal, emotional anxieties that creative people online feel when building an audience or monetizing work, and increasingly being tied to kind of rules of the platform economy. And we started with this question of, in 15 years, will we still be asking people to like and subscribe? And I think like a lot of us can't. And I think that's troubling. And it hints that we really need new forms of like imagination of how our creator economy could work. So I think like what comes after this is more collaborative releasing. It's more networks of creators. My background within cooperatives is like one part of that. And I think it's a different set of values as well. So values of cooperation over competition and forming creator owned systems where our rules can be defined by our purpose and what we want to put out in the world, not by these kinds of arbitrary rules by the platforms that we use.
Yeah, and I think we're at such an interesting state. Like we had this boom of NFTs, for example, where like a lot of people release collections and then a lot of people are now like flipping these NFTs, but then also the real creator, like the people that are making amazing art in their basements, they're not really there yet, or they don't necessarily all of them are there yet. And I'm just wondering with tokenomics and everything, where this is all going and how do we still like foster a healthy kind of community, right? Like in the crypto space, especially, and with the intentions we said. So what do you think is like the most important thing when like we are bringing in monetary values and we're trying to form like a meta label, but how do we balance the thing of like, coordination, monetization, and so on? Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that there are a lot of mistakes being made right now. We have this incredible toolkit, and I think people are hard coding biases from decades past of like neoliberal bias or it's kind of like decades of Friedman-esque financial maximization. And I think that a new kind of framing is necessary, like at the start. And I look to work on thinking about the solidarity economics as a framework. I think that creative communities have a set of cultural values that are things that the market cannot see. I think if it has to do with collective care, friendship, building things that serve the purpose of meeting people's basic needs rather than making money. Those aren't always things that are the most obvious when thinking about things from like a kind of like default financialized perspective. I think that to connect with creative communities and the kind of existing value sets, I would recommend just going backwards and then looking at solidarity economics. All the groups from centuries past and the models that have existed for people pooling money to help each other out, for people creating community land trusts, people creating worker cooperatives, credit unions, lending circles, or community currencies, time banking systems. Like these are all things that is what brought me in. I see Web3 as like a set of tools to empower a new solidarity economy. But I think many people would see the tools and think we can take the rules from the existing creator economy and put them on these kinds of rails. And so I think like at the heart of it, there are kind of like philosophical biases that may be baked in. And I think it's just about framing and understanding like what are we referencing when we're creating tools? What are our defaults? What are our biases?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And also I was thinking about this just now, like why when we see an art piece, right, there's no really meaning behind it unless a collective or a group of people decide that there's meaning behind it, that there's value behind it. So I'm really excited to see where all of this is going and what kind of tools we are going to use more and more to amplify this. I want to talk a bit about Ampled and what you guys are building there. I would love to know and hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a project that started several years ago, just right before COVID. In a lot of ways, this project was like a DAO. So it was at least a dozen people at a time from different tech companies, like people from Kickstarter, people from Patreon, people from Google, people from Spotify, that came together in spare time to build a platform that was owned by creators and workers. So it is a platform where musicians can get monthly recurring predictable support as a form of like patronage. So $3 a month or whatever people want above that. And then getting access to anything like behind the scenes content that they post. Yeah, there was, a global community of people that basically were aligned around these values and not anything that would expect financial return. But I think people were attracted to the kind of imagination of what it could mean for our broader online creative economy and how does collective ownership fit in. If you have a network that is completely owned by artists, then it functions very differently and has very different value sets. And it can even be smaller. It doesn't have to play by the same rules of venture capital. I think we have always used this analogy of a local bar. Like, what would a platform be like if it was a local bar? Local bars are successful if people show up, if people have fun, if people spend enough money to keep the lights on. And it becomes this kind of like third space, right? Like where people kind of gain social connections, social context from. And it can be its own kind of community institution as well. And I think that, Ampled is like a project that is really just meant to explore the space of what a platform can be. Can it be built not for financial maximization? Can it be built to help serve people's needs? Can it be something that just exists for hundreds of people as well, and that is co-owned by everyone. So like that has been my kind of like personal introduction to like community governance, creating bylaws, having elections for board representatives, and none of that being on chain. And it's also kind of like colored my opinion on like, are we sometimes being too over reliant on thinking about on chain governance? I know Nathan Schneider has written a bit about this, about like the limits of on chain or governance or token voting. I think there's a role for politics. I think there's a role for trust in organizations, and just writing out those bylaws collaboratively has been very interesting for us. And they're very simple to read. They have cartoons in them. We have a decision-making matrix that shows all the decisions that who's in charge of making. And so like we've created our own kind of DAO in a way of like a group of people from around the country and around the world building a thing and self-governing and collectively owning.
That's really interesting because it's a different kind of intention that you go into it, right? Like people, if you start working for an organization, you expect something really big, or you know, like if you have a shared vision, like you just mentioned the bar idea, I think that's really fitting. If you do that because you feel like there's a need for something, there's a need for a space, there's a need for this platform. So you set out to do it no matter what, and not necessarily going to the extreme. I think we're in venture capital as well. There's this thing that we go to the extreme, right? It's always about the next round. It's always about being the next unicorn, and that can get really mixed up. Or I think this can be like an extremism of some kind of form. And I like the idea that you said it's from creators for creators, and it has this community aspect. Do you see this there right now? Are there any other projects that you see have interesting value proposition where you like seeing a DAO or you seeing a community and like, oh, okay, they're really interesting? Because I see, for example, DAOs or communities that you have to enter, and there's all these barriers, or there's already like a close group of people and you can't really enter. And I'm wondering, what is your kind of like with the onboarding, and like what kind of things do you see that you're like, oh, I'm really excited about this project, for example?
Well, I do really appreciate Friends with Benefits for having like an explicit social or cultural aim. I think if you look closely at the model, I think almost anyone would find something that they would view imperfect about it. But I do really appreciate the transparency and the care from the people that maintain the community and work there. I also really like Water and Music a lot. A group of people within the music industry or music writers joining together to write really high quality reports. I love that this group comes together and has a specific output. And I also really love that it started as a solo project from Sherry Hu. So this kind of arc of a solo creative project turning into a Patreon, which gained enough supporters where there were a few employees, and then turn into full collectively owned community that is co-producing together. I think that's like a very inspiring arc for where a creator economy could go, and the possibilities to evolve beyond this kind of solopreneur journey. And I think Songcamp is very interesting to me as well. Group of musicians, most recently in their third kind of release called Chaos, had 77 people come together, wrote 40 something songs together in several weeks, and marketed it together, came together under one common identity. This is just like a very kind of like fascinating alternative to doing it all on your own. It doesn't mean that you can't have your own identity and personality as a solo artist too, but I think it's like a pioneering really interesting models for creators to join together. It's a nice addition to someone's solo practice. It's like a new way to express yourself, and I think that people found a lot of success from it too. So I'm very inspired by these stories of, you know, things like Water and Music and Songcamp, of different kinds of creative people, writers, musicians coming together to form these common identities and release work together.
You mentioned two music projects, and I think there's so much in the music industry to be explored with, not even like events, but also, you know, like you mentioned, monetizations of platforms, or I think there's always because musicians are really creative people, they have this natural ability to come together and create something great out of like thin air, out of like I would say low capital or whatever. And it's like I hope to see that there's going to be more of these cool projects like and representation of cool artists and what they can do together. And you also mentioned like the solopreneur kind of, we went through this era of like everyone is their own kind of business, everyone has their own kind of business, and it's like this is not really sustainable, right? Like this, how are we going to live isolated and everyone is creating content on their own? Or I don't think it's sustainable in the future. And I think spaces like you mentioned Metalabel could actually offer people to share an identity and to be like, okay, this is what we stand for. And yeah, I think this is really exciting. And yeah, I'm wondering, what are you looking forward to in 2023?
Well, we're recording this at the February, near the beginning of the year. I'm looking forward to a year of fun and exciting releases for Metalabel. So we're working with several groups now of collaborating and supporting like cool collaborative releases. And yeah, I'm excited for kind of more additions to the conversation. I think that we have are like kind of atrophied our like muscle of collaboration over decades and decades. And I sense that we're kind of like at a bit of a turning point of people having a desire to think differently about the more collaborative creative practices. And so I'm excited to see where that goes. And Yancey, who's a co-founder at Metalable, was a co-founder at Kickstarter. And one thing I think is interesting about Kickstarter was it was very hard to describe crowdfunding initially to people until they saw it. And I think for us, building tools for creative communities or solo creators to form more collaborative groups, I think that by demonstrating that, I see that that is maybe part of the seed of what helps kind of transform our creative economy from being so individualistic, from being more competitive. And so, yeah, I look forward to kind of demonstrating this through our own releases, through the own things that we are supporting, and helping show through our own work how we view the future of a creative economy.
Okay, one last question before we wrap it up. We are in the team discussing a lot right now Soulbound tokens and credentials. And I see a lot of positives with it, but also I want to know your opinion. What do you think about like having your identity on chain and having like, for example, Soulbound token, for the community that doesn't know, is like basically a token that is tied to your identity that you cannot exchange with anyone. And I always think about also the right to be forgotten or to start over, kind of. But I'm wondering what you think about like credentials and around communities and so on tokens.
I think that it's very interesting and yields a lot of interesting possibilities. If someone asked me what I think an NFT is, I would just say it's a unit measurement of anything on a computer that anyone can read and write to, like a kind of shared public computer that's a unit of anything. So what could that mean? I think the idea of like a soulbound token as credential of a kind of scene cred or like a display of patronage. I think like so much of our kind of life and identity is tied into the kinds of music we like, the clothes that we wear, how we identify ourselves with different identifiers of our values through scenes and subcultures, and what that could mean to, yeah, like a different way of kind of identifying where we've been, who we've supported, our value sets. And I think we're just at the beginning of exploring that, but it seems interesting to me to like just being able to carry that with you across the web, and the kinds of experiences that could be built for more intimate cultural spaces that are for specific groups of people that have kind of demonstrated specific actions. It's a very open-ended kind of world of possibilities. And I think from a cultural lens, that feels very interesting to think about the kinds of native or custom or bespoke economies and experiences that could result from this.
Yeah, I mean it's really in the infinites of its states, right? But I think I was talking with somebody who was curating for, I think, Boiler Room, and he was like, yeah, I helped all these artists come up, and they're all like big now and doing their own thing. And he was like, I think it would be cool to have something, to have something to say, oh, like this is something I collected while I was with them, or this is some sort of credential I have from that kind of partnership, or yeah. So I think it's really something we are right now looking into within the team, and we're going to explore more in the next episodes. And thank you so much, Austin, for sharing your insights and your wisdom with us. And we're looking forward to what Metalabel is building next and what you guys are coming up with. And yeah, we can't wait to see you guys in the next episode. Have a lovely day.
Great. Thanks so much.